This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, there we go.
Okay. Today we are going to have a talk about the experience of the Second International at the time of nowadays, with a big situation of big crisis, where there's a need for a new international for meeting the task of today. We will have an introduction by Ed Bober about this experience of the Second International. So you are starting for how many time?
Say about 20 minutes, please, okay. Olivier. And please, could you let me know every 5 minutes so that I don't get too carried away?
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, comrades. This is the second in a series that WIN is organizing of meetings on the international workers' movement from the time of Marx and Engels to the present day. The Second International was effectively in existence from 1889 to 1914. At the time, it was known as the Socialist International, and only later did it become known in the movement as the Second International. When I started preparing this introduction, I thought it would be relatively easy because Engels participated in the Second International, Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky, Lenin. I thought, let's have a look at what these great thinkers of the past said about the Second International, and I'll soon be able to make some sense of it that will be relevant to the work that we're doing today. But as I got into this, I realized that what each of those great thinkers said about the Second International wasn't really answering questions that WIN would be asking, or the labor movement today would be asking, about how to deal with international questions with the through the working class movement. What they said is interesting. It's informative from a historical point of view, but Engels' preoccupation at the start of the Second International was really to take up the threads that Marx and Engels had laid down in the First International. They were dealing with debates with the anarchists. Many of the anarchists by this stage had formed their own international, but there were still anarchists working in the Socialist International when it was formed. Engels was involved with others. I mean, he was very much the leading figure in the Second International in its formative years. And he was involved in the early struggles for great steps forward that were made by the working class movement, such as a shorter working day, improvement in working conditions, the ending of child labor, generally making factories safer places, cleaner places to work in. If you go to the later leading figures like Lenin, their work, particularly later as the International degenerated, is preoccupied with the denunciation of the leaders, the reformist leaders of the Second International, for their capitulation, for their lack of struggle against the capitalist systems, or for their accommodation to living within the capitalist system. And so I didn't find any easy answers in my first piece of research for this for this talk that would give a straight answer to the question, why is WIN studying the Second International? So I looked at it another way. I asked the question, what is an international for? And I did get an answer to that, actually, from particularly from the work of Lenin. An international is intended to bring the working class together into one unified army through careful propaganda to develop consciousness of itself as a class. An international works to develop trade unions, to develop mutual societies of workers, to develop circles of art and culture, theoretical study groups, so that the working class builds its own identity, creates its own cohesion as a class. An international combines means of struggle with education to augment the power of the working class. These great aims, which are an advancement on some of the more limited aims of the First International, which in the first place were really simple, straightforward tasks like dealing with the problem of strike breaking by foreign workers being brought into Britain from France. So, you know, we see a progression from the First International to the Second International in the maturity of the tasks it was undertaking and the maturity of the goals it was setting itself. Each international has been organized in its own specific historical circumstances. Each international has been based on the degree of political consciousness within the working class at that time, the level of organization of the working class, the degree of unionization, the degree of political organization. When the Second International was formed, the labor movement of Europe was already organized in Britain, Belgium, France, some parts of Germany, even some parts of Russia and Poland. There were the beginnings of trade unions, of workers' organizations, workers' parties. In America too, the labor movement was getting started with some very, very militant class actions. And in the Second International, from the very beginning, revolutionary socialists, Marxists as they were called, came into debate, came into conflict with what we today would call reformists, although in those days they were known as the possibilists because they limited their aims to what was seen as possible within the framework of the existing system. Germany had a mass social democratic party. Britain had a number of relatively apolitical trade unions and an assortment of small political groups. France had very strong revolutionary traditions. This combination of involvement came into the international from the very beginning. By about the turn of the century, 1900, the focus of debate began to shift from the earlier debates towards the problem of imperialism. The Second International existed for a quarter of a century prior to the start of the First World War. It unified the international working class under the banner of Marxism. Its stated aim was the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. The stated aim was rule by the proletariat. And a big part of the work that it began to do, particularly from 1900 onwards, was resistance to war, resistance to the impending threat of war. The Second International brought about the shorter working day. It achieved sponsored education for young people in some countries, state insurance, pensions, votes for men and women, the right to asylum. there are two institutions in today's movement, 2 days we mark, which are the achievements of the Second International, May Day and International Women's Day. By 1914, the Second International had 10 million members with 50 million sympathizers. It had representatives in parliament, in regional and legislative bodies, and it was very significant politically at this crucial time in the history of capitalism. When we look back on Lenin's comments on the Second International now, we can say he was preoccupied with its capitulation to the establishment. He was preoccupied with its eventual predomination by reformist leaders. And it's therefore worth asking ourselves the question, why was there reformists? Why was there such a grip of reformists on this huge organization that was representing the international workers' movement? In the last couple of decades of the 19th century, there'd been a huge growth in industry, particularly in Britain, and then Belgium, Germany, and France. Just to give you one example, by 1889, Standard Oil Company had replaced 3,000 smaller oil producers. So there'd been a huge concentration of industry in bigger hands. For 40 years, leading up to 1913, Britain made 4% of its investment abroad, leading to a situation whereby 1913, 32% of net national British wealth was held abroad. Together with France, Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland, it actually meant that about 87% of total foreign investment was held by a small group of European countries, by the bourgeois in a small group of European countries. And this coincided with huge economic growth in Europe, based upon the super exploitation of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And this huge boom of economic growth created a strong proletariat, particularly amongst the skilled workers of Europe, who were able to put pressure on their ruling class for concessions. And because there was this super exploitation of the colonial world, it was possible for the bourgeois of the European superpowers to make concessions, big concessions, substantial concessions to the unionized workers, particularly the skilled workers in these countries. So that was why the Second International was able to reduce the working day, to end night work in some industries and reduce it in other industries, to improve the inspection of factories, to end child labor, to certainly aim and bring about an age of 16 years to be the minimum age where work would begin. So there were dramatic leaps forward in the well-being of the working class, even though the working class of Europe was still ruthlessly exploited. But in comparison to half a century earlier, gains had been made, substantial gains. And this, of course, was combined with some dramatic growth of trade unions. For example, the Gaslight Workers Union in London, in just 14 weeks in 1889, its membership rose from 50 to 5,000. And they won an increase in wages and a reduction in hours. Again, I'm not making too much of this, but some parallels there with what's been happening recently with strike waves and thousands of workers in hitherto unorganized industries coming to join trade unions and form trade unions in the recent period. During this time in the 1880s, 1890s, and the first decade of the 20th century, the top layers of the labor movement developed vested interests in the status quo. These were developments that had not been fully apparent in the days of Marx. So most Marxist writing today portrays the Second International as a reformist organization, because particularly the later comments of Lenin, of Trotsky, of Rosa Luxemburg denounced the Second International for its reformism, because it capitulated to it broke up and capitulated with its reformist leaders siding with their own national bourgeoisie at the start of the First World War. So we have to recognize that each international has been built on the achievements of the internationals that came before it, and it's responded to the weaknesses and mistakes of the movement that came before it, and developed some new ways of thinking and new ways of dealing with a newly emerging situation. So those sectarians today who think that the current task is simply to take up the thread of the movement which Trotsky was trying to assemble in 1938 have missed the point. We need not to be asking how to build the Fourth International, but rather, what is the situation today? What are the requirements of building an international in this century? And we need to intelligently sift out from history the principles around which the great socialist thinkers of the past built their ideas to form not historical replicas, but rather something new and fitting to the 21st century. Behind the banner of the United Nations, Western imperialism is at the moment preparing for an all-out war against China. The war in Ukraine is just a little curtain raiser. The working class of the world has to organize, as it did in the late 19th century, in millions to resist war. This time with greater scope, because the material conditions that allowed reformism to win the day in the leadership of the Second International now are absent from the global economy. Those leaders today who claim the banner of reformism are really preparing watered down versions of austerity with which to cover their lies and deceit over the masses whose electoral votes they seek to win at coming elections. So we have a task now before us, not of building the Second International again, not of building the international that Trotsky was trying to build in 1938, but of building an international appropriate for our times, for our conditions, and learning some of the lessons of each of the internationals that came before. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, John. You got the good time. So if comrades want to take the to speak, they have to raise the hand, please. Bob?
It's am I on? Am I? First of all, I mean, I don't want I want to come back later to Ed's conclusion, by the way. But I just want to point out that in studying the Second International now, for various reasons, there's an enormous amount of information available. For example, somebody's put together all the resolutions and documents of the Second International and published it in a book form in English. I haven't got the details on me, but it's going to be quite easy to find. So that's a really important starting point. Secondly, a lot of thought has been given to the relationship between the Second International and the Third International. And I don't know if anybody's read stuff by Lars Lee, for example, in the States, I think, where he overstates the continuities between the Second International and Lenin. But it's very useful that he does that. It enables us to get over some of the Stalinist idiocy about Lenin. So, you know, those are all, I think, important things to look at in looking at the Second International. So I just wanted to say that for a start. Leave it there for the moment.
Roger.
Well, thank you to Ed for giving us a really worthwhile introduction. But I would like to put this more into the context of linking up with where we left off in the first session, which was on the First International. And I think we need to really try to put ourselves in the minds of the people at the time of the foundation of the Second International to understand what an incredible and huge breakthrough it was. The First International had been, as Engels explained, the aim of the First International was to weld together into one huge army the whole militant working class of Europe and America, and therefore, he said, it could not set out from the principles laid down in the Communist Manifesto. In other words, the First International was not a Marxist organization. It was not even a socialist organization, at the outset anyway. As Engels explained, it consisted of English Owenites and Chartists, French Proudhonists and Blanquists, Irish nationalists, Polish patriots, Italian Mazzinists, and German socialists. And he went on, the English were against special privilege, the French against Bonapartism, the Irish against Britain, the Poles against Russia, the Italians against Austria, and the Germans against capitalism. And what happened in the meantime, although, it was, what Marx and Engels did was to turn it from a worldwide ideological workshop in which all the rival ideas could be tested out in practice against the experiences of the workers in victory and in defeat, and turn it into something entirely different. And although the First International was dashed against the rocks of reaction, once the tide had turned and the newly emergent mass parties and trade unions had established the Socialist International, it was under the banner of the ideas of the Communist Manifesto. And Engels actually celebrated that and said that, in the famous comment of the time, when on the eve of the first worldwide general strike in May Day 1890, when he said that he saw that as the consummation of everything they had done. It was the triumphant consummation of their historic life work. And he said, today's spectacle will open the eyes of the capitalists and landlords of all countries to the fact that today the working men of all countries are united indeed. If only Marx was still by my side to see this with his own eyes. And it was an incredible achievement. And if I could just focus on the strongest section of the Second International, in Germany, it was an incredible achievement. It seemed to be what must have seemed like a complete transformation of the entire world. By 1914, party membership had swelled to well over 1 million members, as Ed said. In 1912, the SPD won 4.3 million votes out of a total of 12.2 million. They had 2.5 million members in affiliated trade unions. They were able to provide for the workers not just a political voice, but also welfare and cultural services, legal aid, social security advice, employment exchanges, drama productions, libraries, peripatetic teachers, choral societies, sports clubs, welfare clinics, holiday packages, rallies, festivals, training courses, a central school for workers' education, and of course the party school. It published 91 daily newspapers. It became a model for socialist parties throughout Europe. It ran Marxist education classes and so on. Now, having established that, let's understand how did reformism therefore gain its ground. Bernstein was the one who pioneered the term revisionism and opposed the idea that the lot of the workers was deteriorating. And he said, no, look, the party should be a democratic socialist reform. The journey is everything, the destination nothing. And that would seem to be a very logical. You could well understand the appeal of that idea, because the living standards and the democratic rights of the working class were just gaining such meteoric progress. And at that time, it was the opposition to Bernstein's idea came from a completely bureaucratic center of Kautsky and the others, who still had the majority support, but they simply crossed themselves and said, oh, no, of course, we still believe in the class struggle. We're still Marxists. We still believe in revolution and so on. But in practice, it meant nothing at all. And actually, the left revolutionary wing, the Rosa Luxemburg wing, during that period, up to the time of the outbreak of the First World War, did not get much support within the ranks, because the reformist ideology seemed to be vindicated by the big increases in living standards that the working classes were achieving. But as late as November 1912, as the storm clouds of the coming World War were gathering, we all know that famous resolution, but they said that the proletarians consider it a crime to fire at each other for the profits of the capitalists, the ambitions of dynasties, or the greater glory of secret diplomatic treaties. And they crossed themselves, if you like, and made all the right gestures and said, we're opposed to a war, but it meant absolutely nothing. It was completely hollow words. Less than 2 years later, they voted for the war. And I found the statements that they made. I won't take long on this, but I just think it's interesting to see how they justified it. They said, we don't decide today for or against war, but the war has come. It's for us to ward off this danger, to safeguard the culture and independence of our country. We feel ourselves in agreement with the international. We recognize the right of every nation to national independence and self-defense. And in particular, they were defending themselves, this was the irony, against the possibility of a victory of Russian despotism, which has soiled itself for the blood of the best of its own peoples and so on. And therefore, they said, we didn't ask for this war, but we have a right to defend ourselves and so on. And then that's why we ended up with this. They just swallowed their speechifying. They tamely swung into support in all the constituent parts of the international behind their kings and their generals and their ministers, and they tamely voted war credits and so on. And as again is well known, the news of this capitulation, which was an outright violation of the solemn and unanimous pledge still ringing in their ears, came as an utter shock, even to those who had been most critical of the social democratic leaders. And Lenin, for instance, was incredulous and assumed that the newspaper reporting it was a forgery perpetrated by the German General Staff. So the point is that the International, if you like, was a victim of its own victories and its own strength. And we know that then, once again, internationalism or Marxism or socialism was reduced to a tiny handful of individuals, and that, of course, leads to the next chapter in the history. So I think we should nevertheless recognize the huge achievement, first of all, both on a theoretical level, at least initially, in really honoring Marxism as the ideology, the accepted worldwide ideology at that time of the international workers' movement, and also in the huge reforms and huge practical difference that the organizations of the Social International made to the self-respect and to the living conditions and to the morale of the working class. And as we see, it had its very negative side too. It's a very dialectical process. That very success it had the incipient seeds within it of the betrayal and the downfall that was to come.
Thanks, Andrew. Anybody else?
Anyway, have another go.
Vas-y, Bob.
Merci. I think Roger's mentioned a very, very central name in all this, which is Karl Kautsky. And I think he deserves a slightly more nuanced approach for reasons I'll go into. It was definitely Kautsky who, with another colleague who later became Prime Minister of Germany, whose name, I'm getting old, I forget names, Robert, somebody or other. Anyway, that worked on the understanding of imperialism. Who?
Oh, maybe I'm wrong.
No.
Heidemann.
No. But when Lenin came to analyze imperialism, he based his work very largely on Kautsky's analysis of imperialism. That itself is an indication of Kautsky's importance and his stance inside the socialist movement. And Kautsky was also the main intellectual opponent of reformism. Particularly, it was raised by the trade union leaders in Germany. And I think at 2 points, at 2 congresses of the SPD, resolutions were raised to take away the revolutionary aims of the organization. And on both occasions, Kautsky was able to get it taken off the agenda. So the aims remained in the aims of the party. Certainly when Lenin was sitting down to write a little booklet called What is to be Done, that was front and center in his mind. That's, for example, why he was so scathing about only trade unionism as the basis for the party, nur Gewerkschaftlertum. And he was very, very following lines laid down by Kautsky there. So the puzzle is, and people have now looked at Kautsky again, and I think there's a general consensus that at a certain point he just gave up fighting against revisionism. He didn't spend his life not fighting revisionism. He fought it very hard in the way that he thought was right, which was in its own way avoided some of the sharpness of it. But by the beginning of the 20th century, he'd just sort of given up and let it wash over him. So the question arises then, does that teach us anything about the way we should behave in revolutionary organization? To what, to what degree must we be patient with differences and to what degree should we be very sharp with differences because we know they can grow into a monstrous deformation. So that's an important point to arise out of that experience of the Second International. But again, to emphasize, look at Lenin's book on imperialism. It's totally the pivotal work where he was getting ready to go back to Russia and lead the Russian Revolution, which he had refused, in a way that he had refused to lead the 1905 revolution. He didn't, for example, in anticipating 1905, he didn't say, and the working class will seize power and create a socialist society. He said, it won't happen in 1905. But in 1917, he said, yes, it will happen. So he was a man formed by, in many ways, formed by the Second International. But he somehow went beyond it. Sorry, I'll stop there.
Anybody else?
Matthew's got his hand up.
I'll say something if you want. I think what Bob said about Lenin. I mean, I think that the thing about Lenin, of course, is as he said, alluded to, is the impact of the Russian Revolution of 05-06. Which, of course, then, I mean, actually, as Luxemburg points out, actually sort of underlines the question of the attitude of the German of the SPD towards actual revolution, and she was deeply critical of the response to actual revolution going on in Russia, and I think that the revolution of 1905-06 is actually, I mean, as been said by numerous commentators, the dress rehearsal for 1917, but very important in terms of its, how the change of understanding, and most clearly drawn out by Trotsky, obviously in Results and Prospects of Permanent Revolution, that in fact, of course, it is the working class that is the only force in society capable of liberating the society. The ruling class has actually abdicated, even its own historic tasks because it's so afraid of the working class. That was the key, and in terms, I mean, the important thing, of course, obviously in Russia, of course, is the creation exactly of the Soviet as the power of the working class itself. And the point being, obviously, is that it's Trotsky that sees this at first, and a few others, and the Bolsheviks are pretty slow to take it up. And it's really that demonstration of actual revolution, and which draws all this out. I think that the other important thing, really, obviously, in terms of the evolution of for capitalism and the Second International, of course, is the Paris Commune in 1871, as a key point, which the working class first really appears on the scene and as a force for itself, and terrifies the life out of the ruling class. And you can see, I mean, there's actually a depression for the next 20 years. As a result, as a political result, I think of the Paris Commune and the advent of imperialism, the dividing, the final version of colonial imperialism, where the division of Africa and so on and so forth, as an attempt, obviously, to divert and take in a chunk of the working class, and the concessions to the working class, as has been said, I mean, are from that. The fear of that force of appearing on the streets of Paris, and clearly, the working class announcing itself as the key actor
in terms of you know the alternative to the bourgeoisie. I think there's two other points. I think first of all, obviously the trade unions are critical. I mean, the thing is, obviously the unions are different in different places. I mean, in Britain, obviously it comes. British unions are more conservative generally, and come out, you know, precede the political organisation. Certainly, many of them. The mass unions, obviously, there's an influence. I mean, you can see, you know, particularly through Eleanor Marx and her influence on the gas workers and the formation of the T&G. Through the Dockers strike, you know, there was this, you know, the growth of mass unions in Britain in the 1880s. But the unions actually come directly from the party in most of the places. They're actually directly linked to a socialist political organisation, which is a different form of politics. But it's then the conservatism within and reformism within the unions, and the, you know, the fact that, you know, we've now had these things in place for in excess of, you know, a century and a half in many cases, and that they are thoroughly integrated. I mean, the thing is, we're looking at unions now. Of course, the union apparatus is thoroughly integrated into all aspects. You know, whether that's the management, the state function, the rest of it. You know, that these things actually now form you know, certainly in the form. The bureaucracy itself form an obstacle to the working class. It must be clearly stated. I mean, these are actually now used as instruments of control. There's a profound contradiction between, you know, the working class itself, you know, as organised in many ways in the unions, but also the interest, and then the interest of the union bureaucracy and the integration of the union bureaucracy into the mechanisms of the capitalist class. So there's that. The other one is in terms of the Third International, and I think that, you know, the problem is, I think, you know, clearly that split is extremely, as you might expect, extremely messy, dirty split, and conducted in ways in which, you know, weren't necessarily done with any kind of, you know, consideration of trying to get, you know, a result. But, you know, merely to try and establish the Third International on the basis of the Russian Revolution. So, I mean, you get the position where the you know, for instance, in Italy, of course, the PSI actually majority support the Third International, and then is split. You know, rather than throw out the right wing, the left actually splits, which is you know, it's bizarre. And you get the situation, you know, in other places where that's a whole process. You know, the establishment of the Third International, you know, is not done in a way to optimise, you know, taking as many forces as possible, and you know, and it's done across, you know, I mean, in Britain, of course, is worse because obviously the CPGB is the worst, or, you know, in line with the Labour Party. And the problem is, of course, you deal with Britain, of course, you're looking at the worst organisations of each international. You know, the Labour Party was by far the worst political organisation of the Second International. The same CPGB was acknowledged as the worst, certainly the worst communist party in Europe, which is why it was used to move the export from Trotsky in 1927. Because it was expendable, you know, both from the point of view of the political level of its membership and the size of it and its influence and the rest of it, much worse than any other country. And this is our political inheritance, and we have to take that into account as well. Thanks.
Anybody else? Bob, again.
Thanks, Matthew. In relation to what you say about the trade unions, I was just reading, probably because of Olivier's friends, I've just been reading Trotsky's last very last writing is Trade Unions in the Epoch of Imperialist Decay. And it's very clear that actually it's a responsibility of revolutionaries to work with the within the trade unions as you know, to be at the heart of trade unionism, if they can be, to be the best fighters to build the trade union, have the best arguments for the advancement of the trade union. I mean, it's intriguing that you have now running the RMT and running the UCW, the CWU in Britain, two of some of the best trade union fighters that the tradition has come up with. You know, it has to be thought about, I think, not to make a fetish of them, but they've kicked a door open, and the working class can make some progress through that door, and we have to think about that.
Hi, sorry, it's Richard.
Come on.
Hello. So obviously it's embarrassing because I was late, so I didn't hear the introduction, and I've only heard the exchange just now between Matthew and Bob about the trade union. So I don't know if it's appropriate to comment on that or not.
Yeah.
I think you should comment, Richard, as nobody else is saying anything. I think your contribution will be valuable.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, Matthew's made an important point about the parties of the Second International, which is that they were not founded by the trade unions in the way that the British Labour Party was in the main, and that in fact, trade unions in Germany certainly, and also to a large extent, not exclusively, but to a large extent in Russia, were promoted by the revolutionary social democracy and came about as a result. That didn't mean that they were immune from the pressures of degeneration at all, because as we know, the spontaneous activity of the trade unions doesn't necessarily lead to socialist awareness, but can lead to all sorts of reformist ideas. But the social democracy sought to develop and steer them in that direction. Now, it's important, I think, therefore, to look at what Bob said about Trotsky's writings on the trade unions in the Epoch of Imperialist Decay, and also other writings on the trade unions towards the end of his life. Not because everything Trotsky says is right, but because that they do tend to distill a great deal of the experience of the revolutionary internationals, and are a good starting point for consideration. And I think Bob's absolutely right. Marxists have to be, at the heart of the trade unions. Marxists have to work in the trade unions. Marxists don't seek to artificially divide the trade unions. On the other hand, we have to remain, extremely critical and vigilant about the role of the trade union leaders, and even some of the most left-wing trade union leaders, like my friend Eddie Dempsey and also Mick Lynch in the RMT, and clearly Dave Ward and Chris Webb in the CWU, because they did call off their strikes during the course of the royal funeral, and we can debate whether that was right or not. But certainly for the RMT to have supported the postponement without without a fresh date, of a TUC conference that was under pressure to consider joint strike action around pay was a completely unwarranted compromise. And we have to ask ourselves, therefore, whether good individual trade union members, Eddie says to me, for example, I don't need a party, my party is the RMT. But we have to ask ourselves whether outside of the existence of a large revolutionary force, whether we will see more of these sorts of unnecessary compromises because of the absence of a serious force with a strategy for power. And that's why in 1938, only 2 years before the document that Bob is citing, in the program of the Fourth International, Trotsky makes the point that, of course, participation in the reactionary trade unions, as he puts it, the reactionary trade unions, by which he means trade unions under the control of a right-wing bureaucracy, is mandatory, and anybody that won't go along with that principle ought to leave the Fourth International. But then he also goes on to make the point that that as well as being, striving to renew the top leadership of the trade unions, advancing new militant leaders in place of the careerists and the functionaries, he also says we need to create in all possible instances independent militant organisations corresponding more closely to the tasks of mass struggle against bourgeois society, and if necessary, not flinching even in the face of a direct break with the conservative apparatus of the trade unions. If it be criminal to turn one's back on the mass organisations for the sake of fostering sectarian factions, it is no less so passively to tolerate subordination of the mass movement to the control of reactionary or disguised bureaucratic cliques. So I think what that shows for us is that particularly in a country like Britain, but also, and I think this is the case now in most countries in the world, where the trade unions are not under the direction or even the strategic influence of parties that are playing a positive role trying to advance the class struggle, that alongside participating in the trade unions, we need to be looking to building independent and anti-bureaucratic alliances of workers within and across the unions in order to ensure that struggles aren't held back, and that task is made immeasurably more difficult where there's no independent working class political party. I won't now talk about the Second International in that context, because that really would be impertinent, having missed the whole of Ed's introduction. So sorry.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Conrad.
Come on.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, the other thing I think that I would say is that I, profoundly disagree with Lars T. Lee and his obsession with Lenin. I mean, for instance, I think that the sharpest point of this actually is where he holds that Lenin during the April theses was held a Kautskyite position that was not in favour of the overthrow of the regime by the working class, which is just nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. And basically attempting to manufacture history to suit your own position. So, I mean, in those terms, I mean, obviously, it's good that there is now exploration, of all these old documents, and people, as you say, publishing, all the old Second International documents, which we should certainly read, in addition to those of the Third. It's useful, but I think that in his terms, as I say, he's attempting to manufacture history to suit his own position. So the other thing I think in terms of the unions is, I mean, it's quite clear that given the nature of where the union bureaucracy is, and sitting, effectively sitting between the working class and the capitalist class, and then of course being divorced in many cases. I mean, if you from that working class, both by its own material position and by the lack of democracy and accountability in most of the unions. I mean, you go through the structures of most of the unions, and I mean, bureaucracy more or less can do what the hell they want. You know, they're not called to account. You know, you can look at any of them, and that is the case. So you see this layer. And the problem is, of course, that at the moment with a sharp conflict, and you can see it, you know, here, you can see it here in Britain, you can see it in the US, where the bureaucracy has been used over and over again as a firefighting force for the capitalist class. And you can see it here the same, where you know, efforts to actually generalise this whole issue of the cost of living and bring in, you know, the issue of general strike or war or whatever else. Being, you know, the thing is, they're attempting to maintain a sectionalisation, attempting to prevent it breaking out from beyond one-day strikes. You know, the whole thing, and you know, the conflict between the interests of the working class and the interests of that union bureaucracy is going to get sharper and sharper, and we know which side we stand on. And the point being also, I mean, is, you know, it will, in any case, be exceedingly difficult, as we can see in any historical terms, for a person, an individual, to be a full-time union functionary for any length of time and not be sucked into that, you know, into actually that sort of function. You know, even with the weight of a revolutionary organisation behind them, it would take an exceptional effort. For those people without such, it's impossible, completely impossible. Thanks.
Roger.
No, I just wanted to suggest that maybe Ed could reply to some of the points, and that might actually stimulate a bit more discussion.
Okay, well, comrades, I mean, I found it an interesting discussion. So one of the issues raised was, you know, Lenin's attitude to differences within the Second International. What does it teach us with regard to acceptance of diversity, acceptance of differences? I mean, certainly we get from Lenin, as indeed we do from Marx and Trotsky as well, that differences are a source of debate, and debate is a source of learning, deepening the understanding of the movement, and so on. At what point you get to the stage where the differences are so fundamental that they require parting company, as you know, Lenin rightly understood was the case with the Second International in 1914. You know, we are talking about really cataclysmic, world-changing events, such as the start of the First World War, where it's absolutely obvious that the movement has to strike out in a different path from those who are supporting it. And it takes some political genius to calculate the exact timing, the exact sort of point of why that happens. I mean, you know, it's well known that the founding gathering that led to the formation of the Third International. I mean, we're preempting the next discussion in a way, but it was a small handful of people who met in something about the size of a railway carriage. So it was just a tiny handful of people, and yet, you know, within a few years of that meeting, the working class, through the ideas that were formulated at that meeting, that crystallized at that meeting, through the organization that came out of that meeting, the working class was in power on 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. You know, making those judgments of when you make the break. I mean, I think we'll know it when we see it. And of course, it's different circumstances today But we have to study the work of those great leaders to understand when it's time to set out on our own and part company with the reformists. That, of course, all of those experiences happened in a very different time from the time we currently live in. I mean, when we have a new, I mean, what we're looking for now is to gather together the first threads of a brand new movement. We won't be calling it the Fourth International, but we won't be calling it the Fifth International or anything balmy, because when Trotsky said they're going to call it the Fourth International, the Third International was on everyone's mind. People knew what it was. Today, it would be meaningless to call it a Fourth International or a Fifth International. It's we have to, in the first place, build a workers' movement that brings the militant part of the movement in each country, that brings the workers together in each country where workers are active, so that they, I mean, the scope for doing it in this, with this current technology is infinitely greater. What's holding the movement back from doing it, I think, is the fact that at the moment, I mean, apart from trade unions, we globally, we have no effective workers' parties because they've fizzled out, and a new generation of workers in struggle hasn't got to the point yet where the reality of the scale of the tasks that face us has become apparent enough to make it clear that a new workers' political party globally needs to be built. So we're dealing with timescales in politics are very unpredictable, and we're dealing with a situation that seems like nothing fundamental is changing, but yet at an elementary level in politics, experiences are being accumulated by advanced workers that will lead at some point to the, and it may come quickly. We don't know. It may come suddenly out of the blue, but will lead to the advanced workers to this conclusion that we have to have political organization at an international level. We have to have it at a national level first as well. What we can say, feeding into that, is that the bureaucrats of today's movement find it far more difficult to hold on to their positions than they did at the time of the Second International. There are no reforms currently available, so they are, in order to justify their position as bureaucrats in the trade unions, they have to either fight for reforms or step to one side and let somebody else do it, which I think is one of the reasons why this, comrades have spoken about it in the discussion so far, the new generation of leaders coming up in the strike movement are far more militant, because they know that the workers that they represent are not going to take things lightly. They know the situation is harsh and grim. I agree that I think it was Richard that raised this question: was it right to call off strikes for the royal funeral? And I agree with Richard that I think the implication of what Richard was saying was it wasn't right. I mean, if ever there was a case for carrying on with the class struggle as a way of attempting to counteract the propaganda. I mean, the Queen's death was a gift to the ruling class just at a time when things were really on the boil. The Queen's death was a gift to the ruling class as a source of media distraction to all the underlying problems that haven't gone away and are not going away. take media attention away from those strikes. And if the trade union leaders had the guts to carry on with those movements, I think it would have contributed to diminishing the capacity of the ruling class to use that as a distraction. I'll leave it there for the moment, comrades. Hopefully, what's been said will stimulate more. I mean, I would actually, just before I do, I think, I mean, the points that Bob made at the very beginning about the number of books that are available, the works that are available on the Second International, is very well, I mean, if comrades want to follow this up, it's very well worth looking at those sources, because there's a whole wealth of wisdom in the stuff that's been published recently from people, either the great thinkers themselves or those who've analysed the work of the great thinkers. So, you know, that's worth having a look at.
Bob?
I'd like to raise one disagreement I have with Ed. Obviously, having been through the collapse of the WRP, the breakup of the WRP, and of the breakup then of the organization we took out of the WRP, and the breakup of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the conclusion we drew, those of us that survived all of that, was that the Fourth International had never really been built, and it still represents its traditions, its documents, and the struggles and deaths of comrades that have fought for it, still represents something that needs to be achieved. So with due respect to what Ed says about changed conditions, and they are changed in many ways that are well worth discussing, what ain't changed is that the crisis of imperialism embodies the struggle of the productive forces to grow, and that coming against the social relations of production of imperialism. And the job that was started in 1917 in the Russian Revolution, the building of the Communist International, still remains to be done. That's why my small band of comrades and I talk about the need to rebuild the Fourth International. So, sorry, just to say.
Roger.
Well, I just wanted to say very quickly that, I mean, the point is, of course, we need to build, we have to build a workers' international. We have to build a single party of the working class worldwide. But the point is about the terminology is important. People just simply do not know what you're talking about if you say you rebuild the Fourth International. It's just meaningless gibberish, and as far as they're concerned. And even more so, those people who talk about the need for a Fifth International, as if the Fourth International had ever actually materialized and taken on flesh. The founding conference of the Fourth International in 1938 was called a conference precisely rather than a congress, precisely because it was a kind of pre-meeting. It was an anticipation of, and it was in line with Trotsky's prognosis that out of the ashes of the Second World War, as he put it, not one stone would be left upon another of the old internationals, and a new international would be born. And everybody, as Ed said, to call for a Fourth International in the 1930s made absolute, simple, common sense to workers, because there were millions of organized workers who were already members of either a Second International or the Third International. And so by saying we need to build a Fourth International, Trotsky was making a political point. It wasn't an organizational one. He was saying those internationals that you already owe your allegiance to have failed. They are not fit for purpose. We need to build a new international. And that made sense in those days. Today, though, I mean, it means nothing except to academics and sectarians, if you like, to say a fourth international. What we need, the way we put it now, we need a world party of the working class, and that's really, in a very, very small and modest way, that's what these meetings are for, to help to bring together, you know, some of the elements who would help to build in their respective countries the forces which could later make up such a party. I also wanted to say one other thing. It's not really related to the topic of this meeting, but since it's come up, first of all, I completely disagree that it's a great, terrible betrayal of the CWU and the RMT to have not called off but postponed their strike action. Yeah, it's a pity that they felt it necessary, but it won't make the slightest difference, in my opinion. It's a temporary pause. If the ruling class really believed, and I don't think even they would deceive themselves on that score, but if they really believed that somehow the death of the Queen would make people forget about the need to struggle for higher wages, then you know, definitely that they will find that that is not the case. I just see from my WhatsApp that on the 1st of October, the RNT and ASNEF and the TESA and the CWU will all be on strike. It'll probably be the biggest day of strike action that has been seen for decades in Britain. And I think, you know, by the time the funeral is over, then we'll be right back where we were. And I don't believe people, you know, the interregnum, the little interruption of the Queen's funeral will be completely forgotten. I hope I'm right on that, and I think I am.
Okay, Temos.
Yes, I want to comment on one or two things, and I'm very interested in what Ed said about parting company when we need to, and this is something very, very critical, I think. The Second International was, if anything, a huge building of huge parties, huge working class parties on the basis of Marxism. And this is something that we should never forget. I mean, it was not just a few Marxists trying to get together and build an international out of small groups in various countries. And this was important because they were not acting in a vacuum. They were under the scrutiny of the working class. And this is what is very important, and we should never forget it. So whether we part company with somebody or not should not be dependent only on our differences, but we should consider who we are parting company with, because the story of the sects after the Second World War has been that they were parting company first with the working class, and then between themselves. It doesn't matter what they did. So there, the question of the strong language of Lenin, it's also important. I never felt at ease with Lenin's works because of this strong language. I could get through it because he was saying important things. But to a modern audience, this language it's meaningless. It's awkward. It's divisive, and it doesn't produce results. So that is also something that we should be very, very careful. I mean, it's not revolutionary to call people you are this and that and the other and all this sort of thing. We should get rid of this need to prove ourselves that we are revolutionaries. We should understand what revolution is, what society is doing, and how things are developing. We also, I think we must reevaluate at every stage the strength of the working class and whether the working class is really developing naturally as capitalist grave diggers in today's world. I think it is still there, but it has a different meaning than it had in the days that these words were said. And we should be, I'm also very skeptical about using the same categories as they were used in the past. We have a different situation now. It doesn't, the essence doesn't change, but the details do. And the details become important. We should not forget that today we don't have the sort of huge factories where a strike would produce huge results. The question becomes more and more political. We should also remember the modern mass manipulation that is being done by the ruling class. And who is the ruling class is another question. We are not talking about the thousands and thousands of small capitalists. We are talking about a handful of monopolists that are the ruling class. And they are controlling the game. And they are manipulating politics. And we should see this enemy as the main issue, and in this struggle, theory, ideology become more and more important. Politics become more important. Organization it's necessary, but we have to see how this can be done. We should also realize that the Second International had started with clear ideas. Today, there are no clear ideas to start with. I mean, if you see the ideas that the revolutionaries are putting forward, that the left is putting forward, there is no common basis in many respects. So I would say that one of the important issues today is to find ways to discuss among a wide range of people, ideas, revolutionaries, workers, trade unions. This discussion has to be done. It has to be done not in closed groupings with 3 or 4 people, or tens or hundreds of people just discussing and making conferences. This has to be done in front of the people. We have to find a way to bring this discussion out. And for this, I think unity of the left is an aim that would be necessary if we want to gain the ear of the workers. And we should not forget that I quite agree that Lenin's imperialism is the linchpin of what is happening today as well. So we have in front of us wars, very, very, very serious wars, that could degenerate into nuclear war any time. And in this situation, since there is no international revolutionary force, the revolution will break out if it breaks out without our realizing. And we'll find ourselves in a turmoil. And we will not have a compass of where to take this movement. We have seen this happening in the Arab Spring. We have seen this happening in Greece. We have seen this happening in the Labour Party. We have seen this happening in Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
These things were real revolution, but we didn't have a direction. We didn't have the forces to take them anywhere. If we had the right ideas, I don't know, but this didn't happen. So I think this is our job today. We are quite far from building a mass revolutionary international, not because we don't want it and we shouldn't try it, but because we cannot do it now. I think our task is to analyze today's world and see what the breaking points are, and try to understand how it will happen, and try to understand how to intervene if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Demos. Anybody else?
I'd suggest that we ask Ed to sum up if there's no more discussion.
Ed, you're going to...
Okay, well, thank you, comrades. I have found the discussion very interesting, and I've learned a lot from it, and I thank all the comrades who participated. I mean, a lot has already been said that sort of brings the threads together. I really like the point that I think it was Bob Archer made that well, maybe it wasn't Bob. I've lost track in my notes. Whoever said the job started in 1917 still remains to be done. That's a very good point. We are starting from a different position, a very different position than Lenin was in 1917. Things could explode very, very suddenly in Britain or any of the countries of the world at the current situation. One of the things that's been missing from this discussion, and I think perhaps Wynne should come back to it sometime soon, is China.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we are talking about global revolution, and, you know, a huge proportion of the world's manufacturing now takes place in China. When people are saying we're not dealing with factories in Britain in the same way as they were in the late 19th century, we're dealing with factories in China that are 100 times bigger than the factories were in Britain. The scale of production, the production process, the intensity of production, and therefore the power of the working class in China is colossal, and the economy of China is not going forward successfully. If it were possible for the economy of China to go forward successfully for the next 30 years, and through that, as it has for the last 30 years, through that feed in little bits of prosperity to the rest of the capitalist world, then it might be possible to talk about another long, protracted period of growth in capitalism. But that is manifestly not the case. Things in China are looking very, very bad economically. And by implication, things in the rest of the world are looking even more catastrophic. It's a separate discussion, but that's part of the background to why there is a war taking place, a proxy war. It's really a war. It's the beginning of a war between America and its satellites and China. But by proxy, it's taking place in and around Ukraine at the moment. And as I said before in a fairly recent meeting, I kept repeating it, war is the midwife of revolution. We're dealing with a very, very fragile situation for the capitalist class, a situation where we don't know the time scale. I mean, Lenin got it wrong in January 1917. He thought there might be another 50 years of more or less stability before there's a revolution. And within 3 or 4 weeks, the Russian Revolution broke out. Timescales are very, very difficult to predict, but implicit in the situation is monumental scale revolution breaking out somewhere or many places globally. And implicit also in the situation is the fact that the old traditional leaderships, people who regard themselves as leaders, trade union bureaucrats, leaders of political parties and things, will be washed to one side very, very quickly in a new wave of militancy. I'll give a tiny little example. On a global scale, it really is a tiny little example, but it taught me so much. In the summer of 2018, when there was an attempted coup within the Labour Party against the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, myself and a small band of comrades who had come together prior to joining the Labour Party, we'd come together in a little group called the Norwich Socialist Group. I think one or two of you, certainly Bob Archer and Roger, had been along to meetings to speak to this group. A few of us had a meeting in a pub a few days after that coup. And we said we knew that something public had to happen and we didn't know what. So we put out, this was, I think this was about the Wednesday of that week, we put out on social media a message that there would be a gathering in the centre of Norwich in the Market Square on Saturday, that coming weekend. And we had no idea what to expect. We thought there may be 30 people, maybe 20 people might turn up, and we'd have a little rally about it, right? And we came along with a few banners and a megaphone and nothing else, no prearranged speakers. And when we got there, 20 minutes before the appointed time, at 20:11, there was already a crowd of 300 people, right? So this was no official trade union had planned it, no official party. It was just a small group of people had put out a message, and 300 people, and we just had a megaphone. We had no prearranged speakers, no big names, no big celebrities, no people with posh shirts come up from London and all the rest of it. Just us and a megaphone. We went round the crowd talking to a few people we knew, a few young people, a few old people, a few men, a few women. We said, will you get up and say a few words? Say anything you like about Jeremy Corbyn. And we made the megaphone available. And there was a fantastic rally. I mean, literally, I mean, it started with 300 and it grew. There was a fantastic rally of ordinary working people speaking spontaneously. We didn't even say you have to speak for Jeremy Corbyn, so just speak about Jeremy Corbyn. I'll give you one or two examples. A 10-year-old schoolgirl got up and started speaking about the need for people with disability to have more support, right? Meanwhile, I'd been talking to a lad who'd been with British troops in Afghanistan, and I knew him because he was a schoolmate of my son, one of my sons. And I'd been trying, I knew that this chap had come back from the army and been badly treated by the army, and was having problems getting employment and sort of resettling as a civilian. And I'd been trying to, I said, why don't you get up and speak? And he didn't have the confidence to get up and speak until this 10-year-old girl got up and speak. This is a lad of about 20. And he thought, well, if she can speak, I can speak. And he got up and he spoke about his experience as a soldier in Afghanistan and how badly he'd been treated, because when he came back to the country, he then couldn't get a job as a civilian. And then he went out to defend ships in the Mediterranean from pirates. He went out sort of freelancing. It's like a sort of, like a private army employed by the big oil magnates, and freelancing as a soldier on these ships. And then when he came back, because that's kind of work, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off kind of work. When he came back and he went to the labor exchange, he couldn't get any money because he'd been working abroad. So he'd been defending his country in Afghanistan, and then he'd been working abroad because the only job he could get was defending ships against pirates, and he couldn't get any money because he'd been working abroad. And when he said this to the crowd, there was just such a huge wave of support for this story of an ordinary young boy who'd tried his best to do what the establishment had told him to do. And he's ended up with post-traumatic stress disorder and an inability to get any benefits. None of this was orchestrated by anybody official, no trade union. And there was a huge crowd, a massive applause, and loads of support for Jeremy Corbyn. I'm saying that because I think we're in a situation where small groups of activists can be a catalyst to the development of a new movement. It could be several years away. It could start happening within the next few weeks. We have to be ready. We have to be prepared. We have to do whatever groundwork we can, and we will be part of that new army that builds a new international for the working class.
Thanks, Ed. So we are closing this meeting, and I don't know. Oh, Richard. Oh, you're clapping. We are closing the meeting, but I don't know what is the next meeting and the next subject, and so
Roger can tell us. I'm sure Roger can tell us.
Actually, Roger can't tell you.
Yeah.
But don't worry, there will be a meeting next week, and I'm sure it will be, like all our meetings, it'll be well worth going to. You'll get a notice by about Wednesday.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bob's got his hand up.
Yeah, just Roger, we discussed earlier today about Southern Africa, and I think we might be able to get some speakers from Southern Africa if you think that's a goer. I mean, particularly people that are involved in struggles.
That's one idea, and I'll discuss that with you, Bob.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
okay, so see you next week. Bye-bye, comrades.
Thank you very much. Thank you.